Whereas early days yet, it's not quite up to the level of Friday Night with Byline Times, but it will be. Just so you know what happened to that, the studio doubled in price after COVID, and we decided to concentrate on journalism rather than expensive sets. But we're back for the election, and I am joined by our editor, Hardeep Matharu, by our political editor, Adam Bienkov, and our chief reporter, Josiah Mortimer. And we're here to talk today, and we'll be on a podcast. I'll stop looking at the camera because we want to talk to each other, but you can see us on a podcast that'll be released later and on radio in various stations in the north. But let's relax now, forget we're on camera, and just talk to each other like normal human beings who aren't being looked at. And of course, what are we going to talk about today? The first full week of election campaigning. Just to catch up, last week, well, Adam Bienkov, our political editor, had a bit of a result because he had spotted that these two factory workers in high-vis suits were actually Conservative councillors. And since then, we've noticed that shots of people in factories in high-vis suits and everything have to be from behind. So we can't spot Rishi Sunak talking to members of the public who happen to be Conservative Party activists. But I think I'll turn to you first, Adam. How's the first week been? And let's first talk about some of our stories, because we are obviously, we are a news organisation. We like to put forward and platform the work of our journalists. What happened this week?
Well, we had, obviously, last week, an incredibly chaotic start of the campaign for the Conservative Party. Rishi Sunak's rain-sodden speech in Downing Street. The councillor story you just spoke about, various other gaffes from the Prime Minister. It hasn't been quite as gaff-filled this week, but the Conservative Party has continued to stumble. One story we reported this week was of the LBC presenter, Conservative presenter Ian Dale, who had quit his job as a high-profile presenter on the station in order to attempt to stand as a Conservative candidate in his hometown of Tunbridge Wells. We discovered a clip of him describing his hometown in unflattering terms, saying he would rather live somewhere else and he'd never liked the place, etc., etc.
And these aren't old clips. These were clips.
This was from 2 years ago, on his own podcast.
On his own podcast, which I think he said. Anyway, carry on. Sorry.
And he didn't comment at the time, but he's now announced today to obviously that he has quit the campaign because of this clip. He said it was going to be impossible for him to carry on, and he was worried that there will be other clips that would emerge from his long back catalogue of podcasts and radio appearances that would come back to bite him. And in recent months, he has been sort of quite critical of the Conservative Party and some of their policies. So no doubt that would have been the case. But you do wonder why he didn't think of that before launching his campaign to get the seat in Tunbridge Wells.
Yes, he says he couldn't remember saying those things. I mean, maybe this happens when you're on air, so how often is 2 hours a day? Every day, you do forget. I would think I'd remember if I dissed my hometown. And isn't this part of the problem? It actually goes back to a rather famous former Prime Minister who was a journalist and was editor of The Spectator, wrote in The Telegraph, had a column in the Mail, and people constantly dug up contradictory things.
He did, yes. He was able to rise, kind of get past that and still, but it's very difficult. That's why it rarely does happen, actually, where you get a sort of big media figure transferring to become a politician, because the skill sets are very different, and there's always going to be loads of material for your opponents to get at you with.
And I don't think, Boris Johnson would have said particularly awful. He said awful things about Scotland and Liverpool, but maybe he had not said awful things about Uxbridge. That was a huge hurdle to surmount. It was quite cryptic. I mean, we had a tip-off before the announcement that Dale could have had the candidacy or was running for it.
Right.
I suppose a high-profile person like that, and I think he was friends with the outgoing MP Greg Hands, may have been Greg Clark. Sorry, Greg Clark. These Gregs confuse me. Might have thought he'd get it, but obviously somebody else will. Which kind of brings us. I don't bring in Hardeep on this particular issue. Hardeep, hot foot from Hay-on-Wye, where she's been hobnobbing with the great and good.
On behalf of Byline Times, I might add, Peter.
The things people do for love.
No, great reception for Byline Times' work at the Hay-on-Wye Hay Festival.
Hey.
And we were talking about, I was on panel talking about compassion in politics.
Brilliant.
And I made the point that I'm always surprised by the lack of discussion around the established press and how much that feeds into the political culture in which we're all operating in. And
so not just the press. That's what I was going to put on. It's not Ian Dale.
There was a big round of applause for that. So,
yes.
So there's appetite for what we do here.
So this is the problem, without any aspersions on Ian Dale, as a great presenter and broadcaster. Adam's been on the show several times. I hope you'll be back. If he comes back to see his show, maybe there might be a slight hiatus. But this problem of the revolving door between politics, the political media class, it may be relevant. It might be just because we're talking about the media to bring up. I don't know if you, because you're straight from, hey, Hardeep, saw the reports about Keir Starmer having a lunch with the, maybe not Rupert Murdoch himself, was it?
Times editors, Times editor and deputy editor, yeah.
And this was about where they're slightly confusing what they mean by Leveson 2, whether he'd commit not to going forward with Leveson 2. By that, they might have meant the second part of the inquiry or the Section 40 of this Act, which commits them to an independent regulator. So this issue of the relationship between media and politics and the hold they have, and obviously with LBC and Sangeeta Miskell, we see the same issues. To what extent is a media organisation sort of, how would you say it, almost deforming the politics we see? It's a player in the scene. So it's not like you're seeing through a clear glass. You're seeing through a kind of distorting mirror. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, it is extraordinary that one day Ian Dale is a very prominent presenter for LBC, and then the very next day he's saying, I want to be a Conservative MP, and then the next day he's saying, well, I'm not going to do that. I mean, this notion of the politicization of journalism that's a really kind of obvious example of it. But this meeting that was apparently had taken place between Keir Starmer and these figures in the Murdoch press. So Leveson 2 would be part 2 of the inquiry.
If they meant that. Just to stop you, Kelvin McKenzie thought it was about arbitration. So the former editor of The Sun, who also didn't understand privacy versus defamation when it came to Daniel Wotton, but we can talk about that another day, seemed to confuse it was about the costs of going to court, right? He said it was, and that, just for people who don't understand, this was a element of the first Leveson recommendations, that an independent regulator would have an arbitration system which would be cheaper for complainants and could be taken into account if a newspaper didn't go through it. Leveson 2 is, what we were going to talk about, is something slightly even bigger, wasn't it?
Yeah, so the Leveson inquiry took place after the full exposure of the phone hacking scandal by The Guardian, and it was looking into the culture and ethics of the press. But the second part of it specifically was going to look at the relationship between the police and the press.
Yeah. Once the trials had ended, because the problem with Leveson 2, happened in 2011-12. There were various trials, including the phone hacking trial, which didn't conclude to 2014, and they had to hold back not to contempt those. And then they were going to look at the criminality. So we're not sure. By the sound of the Times, and this came out in Pop Bitch as well, they would know they were talking about the second part of that inquiry. Yeah.
But I think, whatever the specifics of it, I think this notion that these editors were meeting with Keir Starmer, and on the premise that you're probably going to become the Prime Minister, what are you going to do that's going to look after our interests? That was the basic point of what was going on there. And
the unsaid thing is whether or not they're going to endorse Labour in the general election.
And so the fact that there's these meetings, they're negotiations essentially, aren't they, Adam? That's what's going on here behind the scenes.
Yeah, whether it's said explicitly or not, I think it would be understood on all sides what they were talking about.
Yeah, are we going to support you or not? What are you going to do? It's a Mexican standard. It's a brokering deal. But cleverly, I'm not talking about the foreign secretary. I'm talking about Starmer's attitude. He didn't commit either way.
Apparently so. And he's been quite non-committal on press reform generally, I think, possibly for that reason. I mean, it may be that he hasn't decided which way Labour are taking, or it may decide that it's probably better for him to have that sort of hold that card in
over their heads. But all this stuff, which has been going on, with one candidate. We've talked about one Conservative candidate leading our front page. When I get to actually finalising it and uploading it all, is also a story about a deputy Conservative Party chairman.
Jonathan Gullis.
Jonathan Gullis, yes.
The great Jonathan Gullis. Yeah, so we got another story from Dan Evans and Tom Latcham today, revealing that Jonathan Gullis received a 5-figure donation from the company JCB, who's got several bases in his constituency. And within a couple of weeks of receiving that donation, they announced that they were closing one of their bases in the constituency at the cost of up to 200 jobs.
Wow.
And despite being very vocal on other things that are going on in his constituency, he's been completely, as far as we can tell, silent on this issue.
Well, some people have accused him of his silence being bought, but just to say that may or may not be the case. We have not received a reply to him, so we can't make that inference. But that's what local people are saying, isn't it?
Yes, and there's also a sort of another story that we reported this week about his relationship with a man who turned out to be a convicted drug dealer, and this was... there was denials from the party about the association between him and the party, but Dan and Tom uncovered photographs suggesting there is a close association between him and the party. Lots of pictures of him with local Conservative activists sort of in group shots together. So it does seem like we're not being told entirely the full story there.
So he's no longer an MP. We should be, the geeks tell us they're no longer members of Parliament. They're prospective candidates for Parliament. Stoke North, is that his constituency? Something like
Stoke-on-Trent.
Stoke-on-Trent North. What's the likelihood, what's the polling showing in that constituency?
I think it looks likely to switch back to Labour. It's in that part of the country.
It was a historic, so Red Wall seat, which went to Labour. Just to catch up a bit on the polls, because Josiah has some very interesting poll results in a moment about voter ID, but it's now been 10 days since the election was called. The polls, as far as last time I looked, really haven't shifted at all, have they?
No, and I think normally as journalists we try and make elections as exciting for our readers as possible.
You love them, come on a bit.
I do love them, and they are exciting, but we always try and convince, it could go either way, and it's on a knife edge. It really isn't. And actually what normally happens in general election campaigns is what the polls show at the start of the campaign is normally pretty close to what actually ends up being the final result. Now, there are some exceptions to that. So a couple of quite recent exceptions. In 2015, the polls were suggesting that it was very close between Ed Miliband, leader of the Labour Party, and David Cameron, leader of the Conservatives. It turned out not to be that case. And so in that case, it was a real polling miss.
How much were they out? 5%? Or?
It wasn't massive, but it was enough to give the Conservatives a majority, whereas there was predictions of a hung Parliament prior to that.
And the fact of the Lib Dems there was
and Lib Dems as well.
Yeah.
The second recent example was 2017, where the polling was actually quite good. It was quite close to the final result, but there was actually a swing over the course of the campaign, and that rarely happens during
two Theresa away from Theresa May
to Labour
to Corbyn.
Now, what John Curtis, the great polling expert, says is that if you take those two kind of examples and other examples of similar things happening, if you look at the worst polling misses that there have ever been in UK history, and the biggest swings from one party to another over the course of a general election campaign, and you add those together, were that to happen in this campaign, you'd still be looking at Labour being the largest party. And if that were to be the case, then Labour would form the government because they've got more friends in Parliament among the other parties, whereas the Conservatives have very few friends in Parliament, unless Reform end up getting loads of seats, which is not looking like they're going to at the moment. So it does look like a Labour victory is pretty certain. What isn't certain is the scale of that victory. So the nature of first past the post voting system means that very small changes in final results can exaggerate the scale of seats. So
it's sort of geared, isn't it? That 1% over to first past the post.
Yeah, the bigger the lead, it exponentially goes up.
Yeah.
So there's the big difference between Labour being the largest party, or even Labour having a small majority, and Labour having a complete wipeout, and the Conservatives being reduced to a few dozen seats, if not even less. And some of the polls suggest that that latter scenario is what we're heading for. The Conservatives were hoping to turn that around in this campaign.
To not be destroyed, but not to win.
And that could still happen. We've got the first election debate next week between Sunak and Starmer. That could be an interesting moment.
Does that shift the polls usually?
Well,
I did with Cleggmania.
But in 2010, it did have an effect. But back then, TV audiences were much bigger than they are now.
Right.
At the last time there was a general election campaign, TV debate, the numbers were much lower than it was in 2010. So it's unlikely to change. Although, of course, there could be a big moment during that, which then goes viral and lots of people see it, but et cetera, et cetera. But no, I think the way things are going, it's not looking like we're going to get a surprise during this campaign, but you never know. And we'll have
but
to
the surprises, these geared on these. But the other thing, just to briefly put in, because you're saying that you needed the biggest swing and all these things to happen, even for Labour to be the biggest overall party, is the element of tactical voting. I know there's a lot of work on that. And obviously, we didn't see that in the council elections. Well, you did in the effect that people, swung away from Labour.
What we did see is that people are becoming voters are becoming very aware of how to vote tactically.
Yeah,
and they're being very efficient with how they use their vote. So that's what we saw in the local elections, and actually
in London as well.
And what we're likely to see, interestingly, after the general election, is a lot more marginal seats than we've ever seen before.
Is this because?
So even if Labour do get a big majority, it could be that the following election could actually be quite close because there's so many marginal seats. So it's not necessarily the case that just because Labour win a big majority, then suddenly they've got hegemony for the next sort of 10, 15 years. It's not necessarily the case at all.
We should get on to Labour. We are going to discuss Labour. It's not all going to be bashing Conservatives. And that's because, people are voting tactically. So Lib Dem and Labour, Lib Dem might vote for Labour to pip over a quite safe Conservative.
The Conservatives are so disliked at the moment. And Rishi Sunak is so disliked at the moment that everybody...
It's an anti-vote.
It's an anti-vote. It's not about massive enthusiasm for the Lib Dems or for Labour. Mm-hmm. It's about getting the Conservatives out by any means necessary.
Right. And just before we get on to what this means, a potential wipeout, we've got some reporting on that, some activities of Suella Braverman and Liz Truss. Let's just go to something else, a factor which Byline Times has been leading on, to be fair. Particularly Adam brought it up in front of Boris Johnson many moons ago, and Josiah's leading our Vote Watch campaign, which has highlighted this, which is voter ID. Because the polling under 25s shows like a cratering of Tory support, Conservative support, like 9%. But there's a problem that Josiah just reported on this today.
There is, yeah. We've just received new polling today at Byline Times showing that nearly a third of 18 to 24-year-olds don't know that they're going to need photo ID to vote in this election. So there's a real worry.
How many people is that?
I mean, it equates to hundreds of thousands of young people. I think, if you take the numbers who were, for example, turned away for not having ID during the local elections this month, and you sort of extrapolate that very roughly for a general election, we're looking at around 100,000 people turned away and denied a vote in the general election because of issues with voter ID. And it's the first general election we've had to use this. It's also, interestingly, Scotland, they haven't really had any elections apart from a by-election where they've had to use ID. So the lack of awareness in Scotland is going to be a really interesting and potentially worrying one for voters there. So it's a bit of we're seeing the experiment of what the Conservatives have done to democracy. Yeah, we're seeing that come to sort of into full play this election, I think.
So Tom Baker from Democracy Unlocked, he called it Unlocked Democracy, said it's a potential catastrophe. I mean, if you imagine hundreds of thousands of people turning up being denied a vote. I mean, it worries me, and we'll get onto this now, Hardeep, where that could lead us, that plays both ways. Ever since Miami, where 600,000 votes or whatever were effectively excluded in 2000, which got Bush in, that both ways going, it's rigged.
Yeah, I think that's a real question. I mean, after Labour did very well in the local elections, we saw some Conservative MPs saying, "Okay, well that means we have to abolish postal voting." Something Adam covered.
Yeah.
So you do see these sort of backlashes, and there have been quite a few changes to that the government has made to voting over the past few years. I mean, one of them, which pretty much no one else has talked about as far as I can see, is that this is the first general election where about 2 million extra overseas voters will be able to vote for the first time. Yeah. So they've been able to register from abroad. If they live overseas for more than 15 years, previously they couldn't vote. Now all of them can. So that's an extra potentially 2 million voters who are involved in this election. And of course, there are democratic arguments for saying if you're a citizen, you have a right to have a say in our elections. The problem we have is that because we have such a Victorian electoral setup in many other ways, these people who've lived abroad for maybe 50 years, they're registering in where they used to live 50 odd years ago. So you have this first past the post voting system, potentially marginal seats, possibly being swung by people who are living in tax havens.
And aside from your coverage at Byline, it's been barely discussed, has it really? This is a massive change.
It is,
and nobody's talking about it. There's very little debate about
And
it.
also, isn't it right? The only verification you require is like one person testifying they think you used to live. You know, you didn't used to. You're living in Monaco, but you might have lived in a swing seat in Uxbridge. Whereas, if you're 8, you can't use a student card. All these restrictions on young people voting, but this is clearly encouraging certain kind of voter in this legislation to vote and deterring other kind of voters. That's what it seems to me. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just gives lie really to the idea that introducing voter ID was about, you know, ensuring the integrity of our elections, because not only can these, you know, many more people vote in UK elections now who live abroad, they can also crucially donate. Yeah. So, and there's no maximum that they can donate to parties. There is a maximum that the parties can then spend on it during an election campaign. But also, helpfully, the Conservatives, helpfully for themselves, I should say, they've just nearly doubled the election spending limits. So we've got the first election.
For how much is it now?
It's now approaching 30 million that they can spend. And the Tories have been the only party really that's ever been able to come near that. And of course, they're the only ones that knew when the general election date was. They've obviously got a few donors who previously have had a lot deeper pockets than Labour, although
and also said problematic things. A guy called Hester who said, we'll get on to Diane Abbott later, that she should be shot. So this is, they say they're guaranteeing electoral integrity against in-person voter fraud, but they're opening us up to foreign influence from more non-domiciled. Most of our newspaper proprietors are non-domiciled. But now any non-domiciled Brit can be a big player financially and, you know, cephalogically in this election.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not the only loophole either. I mean, you know, the electoral watchdog, the Electoral Commission. I mean, it's been gutted in recent years by various pieces of legislation, but they've warned that so many warnings on foreign interference in our elections have gone completely ignored. The fines for parties taking donations that they shouldn't are basically negligible. It's just the cost of doing business. Those fines haven't increased at all, but the spending limits have increased. You know, there's just a plethora of loopholes that remain unclosed, and yet, you know, they did choose to focus on something which really wasn't an issue in many democracy experts' minds, which was this issue of in-person alleged voter fraud. So, it's an issue of priorities, I think. What is interesting as well is whether Labour will say anything about this sort of stuff during the campaign, whether they'll pledge in their manifesto to change some of this stuff. My instinct is that maybe they'll fiddle around the edges of it, but really they won't make they won't repeal much of this work. But
they have
find out soon enough.
They have said something which they lower the voting age to 16, which would be. But obviously, most of these people are going to be in the army at that point.
And I think on voter ID as well, they've also suggested that they will increase the number of IDs that can be used, including non-photographic forms of ID. But they're not committing to scrapping it altogether.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Hardeep, I just want to, because this, you know, these are very populist measures. We see this called voter suppression. We see it a lot in the US, and we've seen what's happened this week with the likely nominee of the Republican Party receiving 34 felony convictions. I'm just wondering, what if we went down that route, which Adam suggests is very possible, of a kind of cratering of conservative support? Where do you see the party heading? And what, if you've been watching, obviously you have, because you're our editor, what's happening with Liz Truss and Suella Braverman, with Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg both supporting Donald Trump. Do you think that's now more, because you've always said that's a likely outcome for the Conservative parties if they lose, that they will head down the Trumpist Republican route? Do you see that more likely this week?
I do. And Josiah and Adam have been reporting this week about some of the platforms that Liz Truss and Suella Braverman are taking up. And they're not that surprising, these platforms, because they are extreme sort of conspiracy ridden sort of narratives that they're going along with. But I think that is going to be the path of the Conservative Party, really. Yeah.
And Did you sense, you've just been at Hey on Why. It's very interesting. There was just watching Question Time and the grilling of Farage at BBC Question Time. We often talk about this, sort of, especially the theatre of cruelty, the current edition, Adam's polling on the cultural measures, that they don't seem to be working. When just out and about, do you think this is a recipe for electoral success, the Conservatives, or alternatively, a way of getting funding from the US, a way of getting media coverage? The whole GB News thing was, whereas it may not work with the electorate, it works for their pay packets. Numerous Conservative MPs appear on GB News and get well paid for it. So does Nigel Farage and Richard Tice. And the Nigel Farage model of political campaigning, as we've seen this week, is don't run for anything, set up a private company, call it REFUC, or that's what it used to be called, REFUC, the abbreviation Reform. And there's a whole new form of politics coming here, which is kind of quite separate from how the public feel.
Well, it was interesting because Theresa May had just been at the Hay Festival the day before I was there, and she was talking about the Conservative Party today and the direction it's going in. She's not the only one. There have been others from that sort of part of the party, the old guard, who are distancing themselves now from the party, saying that they're very concerned about what politics has become. Is it really about service and doing a public duty, or is it more about the personalities? So I think there is, I find it, especially if there's a big defeat, I find it unlikely that somehow the Conservatives will go back into that centre ground. I think it's much more likely. Yeah, I think it's much more likely to go down this populist, more extreme route, because as you say, that is where the money is. That's where the media ecosystem on the right is as well. Not just the newspapers, but GB News and various other platforms.
Question Time.
And so, yeah, and then there's the parallel with Trump and the Republican Party, lots of money flowing there. So I think that will be the direction. It was interesting. I was on a panel at Hay Festival with Danny Dorling, who's a professor at Oxford, who has written for Byline Times a couple of times. And he made this really interesting point. And he said that when New Labour in 1997, when Tony Blair took the Labour Party, more to the right, that prompted the Conservative Party to go further to the right. And it was just a
temporarily, wasn't it? Because there was the phase during Cameron that they sort of tried to occupy.
Well, I was trying, all I was going to say by that was I was
only
trying
after
to
losing a couple of elections.
Yeah, I was trying to understand what he meant by that. I thought it was an interesting comment. This sort of dialectic that takes place between, and I think that if Labour wins an election and is moderately successful at stabilising the country somehow, it will have to prompt the Conservatives to go more to the extremes of the right and go around those populist causes.
Very interesting. We should get to Labour now, I think, just on that basis. So Russell Jones, who did The Week in Tory and has a couple of books now, writes on our Substack, and he talks about this... the one nation, there are still one nation Conservatives, but their nation is probably the Cayman Islands, whereby, and it's a point, the oligarchy, this is what Timothy Snyder, the great professor, says about, this is what they discussed in ancient Greece. Plato, the philosopher, said, well, democracy won't work because people will buy it. And as we've written about, it'll become an oligarchy. You follow the money, and this is a kind of oligarchical tendency, and the money is important. With Labour, we are beginning to see, aren't we, sort of signs of a rightward shift, or at least, it seems to be focused a lot on international affairs. We'll get to that. But there have been allegations this week, I'll start with you, Adam, on this, that in the selection process for the imminent election, which was called sooner than people expected, the kind of small number of people have a lot of power who decide who our Labour MPs are going to be. And that's kind of come to the fore in the last week.
I mean, you'd think after the sort of start of the campaign that the Conservatives had, and with the polls showing up to a 27-point lead for Labour, that they'd be kind of seizing the moment to unite around, a common purpose and heading back into government. That's not what we've seen this week at all. Instead, they've descended into sort of their comfort zone of factionalism. And this has largely been driven by people around Keir Starmer. There has been an attempt to, well, not an attempt, they have deselected a number of candidates and even sitting MPs. Lloyd Russell Moyle, left-wing MP, at the 11th hour, an investigation into an unknown allegation emerged, and so he's now been suspended.
So he can't run.
He can't run now while he's under investigation. Faiza Shaheen, a sort of long-standing candidate in Ian Duncan Smith's seat, has been deselected despite being a sort of popular local figure.
On the basis of what?
On the basis of some liked tweets from her account about Gaza and about Jeremy Corbyn and a number of other things.
Some of these just...
She probably would have taken the seat.
She
from
almost
Ian
certainly
Duncan
would have
Smith.
taken. She almost certainly would have taken the seat. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she's now been replaced as a candidate by an ally of Keir Starmer's aides, Morgan McSweeney. And indeed, most of the slots that have been opened up by these deselections have gone to allies of Keir Starmer's aides.
And these are they're gone to people who often were doing the deselecting, and then they get a seat.
In the case of Faiza Shaheen, two of the people on the panel that decided her deselection have ended up getting seats themselves. So yes, it doesn't look great, and this is upsetting a lot of people, obviously on the left of the party, but also people across the party on the soft left, and even some on the right, particularly in relation to Diane Abbott, long-serving veteran Labour MP, the first black woman in Parliament. And this story emerged. I mean, there had been suggestion that she was going to retire.
Yeah.
For health reasons.
She had been suspended for about a year for some comments.
She was suspended over comments that she made, a letter that she wrote in The Guardian about 13 months ago, where she was suggesting that Jewish, Irish people don't experience the same amount of racism as black people, as people who are visibly non-white.
This is a controversial opinion, but
she immediately apologised. But being
suspended for it.
She was suspended for it, which I think most people in the party understood why she was suspended for that. But the investigation dragged on for a very long time compared to other MPs and candidates. One example, local to here, the Bermondsey MP Neil Coyle, he made some racist comments to a journalist in the lobby. That was resolved relatively quickly, and he's now, as far as we know, a candidate in the upcoming general election. Diane Abbott, this dragged out for a long time, and we now know, due to reporting by the BBC, that actually the investigation concluded at the end of last year.
6 months ago.
6 months ago.
Yeah.
And yet we're only hearing about this just before the selection period comes to an end. So it looked like this had been deliberately dragged out in order to try and force her out. And then there was these briefings to the Times newspaper suggesting there was no way that she was going to be able to stand. This has caused a big backlash in the party.
Yeah.
And yesterday, the deputy leader of Labour Party, Angela Rayner, came out and supported Diane Abbott and said that she wants her to stand. So I think we may see a U-turn.
I think that's happened. I seem to read that even while we came on air that maybe that happened. But two things there. Keir Starmer did go to lunch with the Times. I'm sure that's coincidental. But this briefing, I saw it in the Blair. He got very close. We got close to Murdoch in 1994. That was the deal. Murdoch supported him, and then was very close to senior News International figures. And the problem is this operates in darkness, like this briefing against Pfizer, that she heard about it first from the press and the Diane Abbott stuff. And it gives a few officials, no matter their politics, doesn't really matter, enormous amount of power, these disciplinary processes. It's kind of like a star chamber, is it? It's
And this is a running saw in the party that the people around Keir Starmer, the belief among a lot of MPs from all wings of the party is they've got too much power.
Yeah.
But the thing is, their maximum power is at this stage.
Yeah.
When once Labour forms a government, then power shifts to people like Sue Gray, who will be the chief of staff, and to civil servants, and to departments, and to ministers, and etc. But this is the moment where the advisors around Keir Starmer, this is their moment now.
That's right.
Unfortunately, it's completely overshadowed their campaign, and lots of their messages that they should have been getting out this week, they just haven't been able to get out.
So this was just finally this. I love Hardeep and Josiah's observations about this. Obviously, and I remember, let's be clear, that there were Corbyn supporters and officials briefing the tabloid press about their enemies. Tom Watson would be
yes,
one.
But we didn't see this kind of purge of right-wing.
No, it's not. But that is the problem, using the right-wing press as a conduit, whatever you get.
And I think the sort of broader problem is, if this is how Labour Party is acting now, when everything is going right for them, and if the polls are right and they're going to have this massive majority, How are they going to operate? Where are they going to be showing this lack of tolerance to dissent in government? And what's that going to, what tolerance will they carry on this kind of authoritarian attitude to the country as well?
Yeah.
So these are unanswered questions, but it's it is worrying some people, quite a lot of people in the Labour Party. What we've seen over the last week.
I just wondered, does it worry you, Hardeep?
I mean, in some ways, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the fact this is playing out so publicly, you'd think, why is that in the Labour Party's interest? As you say, the Diane Abbott story has overshadowed the campaign for most of this week. Faiza Shaheen did a very prominent interview on Newsnight, which was almost in tears. Probably would have taken that constituency from Ian Duncan Smith, one of the architects of benefits cuts and sort of an old guard figure on the right. Why is that happening? And I was talking to people at the festival, and there's some suggestion that Keir Starmer wants to be seen as ruthless, or the people around him want him to be seen as ruthless. This is a man who has changed the party, will continue to change the party, and has to convey that somehow to the public and maybe the press as well.
That's the justification they're using, and they're saying that this is a signal saying this is a way of showing that we're no longer the party of Corbyn. The problem is it doesn't look great to
No.
And there was some interesting observations by Luke Trill, a pollster who we've spoken to a number of times. He was suggesting in the focus group that they've been doing this has been going down very badly actually with Conservative switchers to Labour. And the comment that has been coming from them is saying, well, if this is how he treats his own,
yes,
how is he going to treat us when he's Prime Minister? Because it just doesn't look good, this kind of underhand behaviour. And particularly with someone like Diane Abbott, who is not the most politician in the country, but people known her a long time. It just looks disrespectful. To her.
And this guy, I remember the 97. Obviously, there was, and I could never. It was a recurrent theme that from the clause 4, getting rid of clause 4, the element that nationalised the commanding height, that Blair would attack the left to show this was militant and things like that. But he was also quite tolerant. I mean, obviously, Diana Abbott, Jeremy Corbyn remembers, Dennis Skinner, and you had on
Claire
the right,
Short.
Claire Short, you had Frank Field, you had Kate Hoey. That this broad church thing Blair did maintain. He had George Galloway for quite a while in the party.
Because he was confident of his position.
Yeah.
And I think that this action does make the Labour leadership look less confident than Blair did.
There's also a dissonance between, to my view, Keir Starmer's public image. It just doesn't. It just doesn't strike the right chord, because he doesn't seem somebody who is ruthless, and he seems very sort of meticulous and careful as a leader of the Labour Party. Cautious. But this notion that he's trying to be ruthless and brutal, because when he's asked about this in interviews, again, there's a dissonance between the people around him who are telling him to do these things, and then him actually responding to it, where it doesn't seem like he even sort of really believes in the need to be brutal.
Well, I think that's one of his biggest problems, is actually people don't know what he believes. And that's what voters say in these focus groups. So they just don't, it's not that they don't like his politics, they don't really know what his politics are. And I think that's been reinforced by some of the shifts that he's made. When he was running to be Labour leader, he ran on a very similar platform to Jeremy Corbyn. That's not the platform he's running on in this campaign. And that kind of adds to that sense that, what does he really believe? And it may be that we don't actually find that out until he becomes Prime Minister. There were similar doubts about Tony Blair actually before the
Bambi. He was scary. Yeah. He was scary and soft. You get a bit of this bit with Starmer, by the way, that he's boring. They called him Keith. The left called him Keith, but he's also ruthless. So,
yes.
And Blair, what was the Blair sort of image? It was kind of like that, wasn't it?
Bambi, yeah. Like he was a bit soft and people did a bit wet. People didn't really know what he
then he had red eyes. Then he was going to take your tax away.
It was kind of the campaign against Blair was similarly confused to the campaign against Labour and Starmer, where
Bambi.
The Conservatives at the moment don't seem to know whether they want to say that Labour don't have a plan, which is what Rishi Sunak is saying, or they want to say that he does have a plan and it's this dangerous socialist utopia or whatever.
Yes, it's ruthless, but he's useless. The two can't be true. Just a little bit of a revelation, and this is a very interesting moment for me because of being the senior person on this table. And hands up, I was a Labour member in the 80s, and then in the 90s, I worked really a bit of speech writing for Gordon Brown. This is like 98, and already, and we might be seeing examples of this with Rayner and Starmer, there were people coalescing around the Blair-Brown axis and causing division. I worked on a speech about Britishness. It was clear to me he wanted to sort of pave the way that Britishness includes Scottishness, and there's nothing wrong with having a Scottish Prime Minister at some point. But it was very nice. It's great to work with him. It's about identity. But what I noticed is the Praetorian Guard around each leader, if you like, hate the other Praetorian Guard much more than the two leaders or the two sort of Blair and Brown would, because their lives depend on Brown or
And I think
Blair.
that's particularly a Labour trait as well. They call it in the Labour Party near enemy. You're always much more focused on the near enemy rather than the opposition. And we've seen that this week, definitely.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, not fantastic, terrible, but it's interesting to see those signs, because obviously we'll be exploring them if there is a Labour majority. So, I mean, we should clarify that we're not really taking sides on right and left on Labour. Also, we're looking at processes or honesty. As you said with Diane Abbott, this isn't an issue which has upset people just of basic respect across the political Conservatives
Including
as well.
somebody like John McTernan, the former political secretary for Tony Blair, coming out saying this is disgraceful, humiliating somebody like Diane Abbott. So it cuts across the party, I think.
Yeah, it's this politicking. Maybe that's what doesn't go on with people, this game playing. Left can do it too. Millicent did it. It's this machine politics. Hardeep, do you fear that's already going to happen, or is there something that you said? He doesn't give that impression. Starmer hasn't. He only became an MP in 2015. Before then, he was a civil rights law and then DPP, working heading up public prosecutions. But do you see this as inevitable, or this is something which has been exposed now, and maybe it's a good moment for it to get exposed? They might back up from this kind of machine politics.
I agree with Adam. I think we're going to see a lot more of it if Labour wins the next election. I think that is when there's going to be sort of much more open warfare, if you like, between the Labour left and the leadership. That will be very interesting, especially if the Conservative defeat is quite heavy. That's where the opposition will be. I mean, there's been a lot of focus, rightly so, in recent years about the Conservative Party and the various factions and the backbench, the ERG, the European Research Group, holding various leaders to hostage over Brexit and many issues. But in a way, that same dynamic has always existed in the Labour Party. And I do feel, my sense of it is that the people around Starmer feel that the Corbyn years were just so damaging to the party, for whatever reasons they believe that to be true. I mean, electorally maybe is one example, but so damaging that you have to sort of make a real break with it. You have to, with the country's at such a crucial time, this election has to be won. And they're being very pragmatic with, you can't do that old adage of you can't do anything unless you have any power. And they seem to me very focused on that. But I don't know. I'm surprised by the level of publicity that the advisors themselves have encouraged on these factions.
I mean, the other argument they make, people around Starmer, is that look what's happened to the Conservative Party when they haven't purged the extremes of their party. Look what we've seen over the last 14 years. That if Cameron had been more ruthless at the start, then perhaps
Brexit,
we wouldn't have been.
Everything,
That's the argument they make.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I think that you touched on, what the left will do after the election. I think it's a really interesting one. I think. But there's another question, which is, will there be a parliamentary left of the Labour Party after the general election? Because it feels like the path is either to cow the people like the Socialist Campaign Group, the left of the Parliamentary Labour Party, or to reduce their numbers, or both. So it will, this sort of whole idea of an internal opposition within a Labour government that perhaps has a very large majority at the next election. Well, will they even have an internal opposition? Will just their opposition be from opposition parties? And it is this kind of disintegration, this idea of the Labour Broad Church. I think another factor is, the Labour leadership at the minute, and perhaps all Labour leaderships, they really get in their head this sort of Westminster winner takes all mentality, where they get a fraction more of the power than they previously had, or they control the reins, and they think, right, we need to do whatever we can to stop the other side ever getting control of the reins
in their own party.
In their own party. Yeah. So I mean, you had some rule changes under Jeremy Corbyn. There were some deselections. I think that's been taken to absolute to extremes under Keir Starmer now. There were big rule changes a couple of years ago when Starmer first came in. Basically, the underlying message was, we're never going to let what happened under Corbyn happen again. and again, the subtext of that, we're not going to let the far left of the party take over again.
I think there's another message. I think though you say there were these ERG groups that broke away, and you have now common sense groups and endless groups. You have natcoms and popcons, and it's sort of like some weird medley at a festival of forms of conservatism. But actually, was discipline is the hallmark of that. How many people are deselected? Has anybody ever been deselected unless there's several being caught, doing sort of allegations of sexual offences? That seems to be the only, or lobbying, the only way to get deselected. That don't really seem that there's, the Tories conspire privately. The Labour seems to conspire publicly.
I think the only sort of close example would be when Boris Johnson got rid of the Conservative MPs, anti-Brexit Conservative MPs around the proroguing of Parliament.
But that was extraordinary for the Conservatives.
Yeah, and a lot of those ended up coming back anyway.
But look, I think it did change the Tory party, though, didn't it? It has paved the way for the extremification of the Tory party, that the sort of GB newsification of the Tories that we now see the impact of.
And who pushed for that? It was Dominic Cummings, then Boris Johnson's special advisor, who said he's never liked the Tories anyway, keeps on saying they should be destroyed.
But it's interesting that, 2 weeks, I guess, into the campaign, or a week or so, week and a half, and these are the sort of the issues that are being dissected. Because for me, just being out and about and just... there isn't that energy of an election campaign. I mean, obviously, there's quite a long way to go yet. We've got 5 more weeks, and maybe these leadership debates that are going to be televised will add to the build-up. But there just doesn't seem that sense of energy or dynamism, or, there's going to be an election, people being galvanised. I certainly feel the Conservative campaign trail has revolved around Rishi Sunak, but he seems like a lone figure. I mean, he's not there. There's no David Cameron by his side, or even Jeremy Hunt, or so many MPs are standing down. It very much is him out on his own in a number of questionable photo opportunities.
And really
struggling. And I mean, I'm actually surprised because I think Labour has dominated whichever headlines it is about, whether through Diane Abbott or otherwise. They have dominated the last week in terms of the election campaign, in terms of these internal sort of, these internal feuds. And I think that already shows that something has shifted.
People are already assuming they're coming into power.
There is something, there's an energy change.
I think the one exception to that is the National Service announcement. Although that seems to have, I mean, when it first came out, some of the polls suggested that there was sort of narrow support for it. Our poll today with We Think actually found, I think it's 57% of people now oppose the idea. Because I think there is a sense now that even when voters may support a general policy by the government, the fact that it's the Conservatives suggesting it means people then oppose it, because there's a big difference when you actually put Conservative, the word, the party's name in the polling question, and when you don't put it in, support goes up, and when you put the name in, support goes down. And I think that's the problem that nobody's really listening to. But he is really struggling. I mean, there was an event, another one of these high-vis events in a factory yesterday, and there was actually, I mean, the reason they do these events is because they know that when it's all employees working there, or Conservative councillors working there, they know that they're not going to ask difficult questions because they don't want to upset their boss, they don't want to cause a scene. But actually, we got a rare moment yesterday where a member of staff at one of these factories actually did ask a sort of quite sharp question of the Prime Minister. And the man, again, that they'd been faced away from the cameras, we couldn't see his face when he was asking the question or his identity. But he said that his mother had died during the pandemic. And he said around the same time that you, Prime Minister, had been breaking COVID rules in Downing Street. And he said, quite cuttingly, how could we ever trust you again? And this was quite, I mean, you could hear the emotion in his voice. And Rishi Sunak's reaction was just extraordinary. He started off by saying, I'm sorry to hear about your loss. And then he immediately pivoted to saying, but you may remember me for that time when I introduced furlough. And that's when the country got to know me. And I was working for the country so hard. And started immediately talking about himself. And there's no sort of empathetic connection with the public. He just doesn't have that. I think he's even worse than Theresa May was during the 2017 campaign. It's really quite extraordinary how badly a campaigner is.
I think because his rise was so quick. I mean, it's interesting to actually talk a little bit now about him. He's not really he's not really a politician. He doesn't have any level of expertise or experience. He wasn't in Parliament very long before he was Chancellor. He never comes across in a way that he has the skills to, as you say, connect with the public or even look, or the policies that he's going along with or the advice he's taking from people. To me, he's always seemed utterly out of his depth. Perhaps, as a Chancellor, perhaps that was a bit different, but then the pandemic came. But he just doesn't... He's just not a politician. I think it raises sort of wider questions about
why do you go into politics?
Who is in politics today, and how have we ended up with a situation where he's running this incredibly presidential campaign, but he clearly is struggling, as you say. He must know that about himself.
Well, I do think this campaign is sort of showing the sort of lack of talent in politics. Of course, you look at all of the party leaders; none of them are particularly charismatic. I mean, Starmer, Sunak. Even John Swinney, is not the most exciting in Scotland, most exciting politician. Where are the big political figures? And I think we are kind of reaching the end of a period now where a lot of talent has drained out of British politics, and that may change. We're going to, after this election, there's going to be a lot of new MPs in Parliament. Maybe one of those or several of those will emerge to become big figures, but there just aren't those big figures that we can look back to in the past under previous governments.
And the pathway certainly within Labour, Adam, you might know more about this than me, but it seems to be that they're plucking their intake much more from places like think tanks rather than the old trade union routes, that Labour used to go for. I don't know what the picture is like in the Conservatives. I mean, as of a few days ago, they were still looking for 150 odd candidates.
They're looking for more than before.
So I think they'll pluck anyone off the street now. But
Ian Dale's not available yet. Maybe not for Tunbridge Wells.
They must have found one other person to go for the seat. But yeah, certainly the stream of people who are becoming MPs, I think, is going to be a really interesting one to watch.
Well, it's not a very attractive career for people anymore. There's so much pressure, and there's so much abuse they get as well that it's just not appealing to many people to go into politics. I mean, we hear a lot about the salary. Actually, I think the money MPs get is pretty good, but I think it's more just the lifestyle that you have to lead as an MP and the scrutiny you come under and the abuse that you get. It's just not appealing to many people.
So it may be worth having. Sorry, Hardeep.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention one thing. Apropos this is a comment from Sunak about the furlough scheme, because the pandemic was such a big thing for this country. So many people died that arguably didn't need to because of incompetence.
And his policies, Eat Out to Help Out, came up in the COVID inquiry, I think, under Casey's testimony, how disastrous that was.
Yeah, I mean, because things move so quickly these days, don't they? News, journalism, but I remember as the pandemic, we were having discussions, our news team, about when the inquiry started. And I remember us saying, could it be a seminal moment? Could it be, something where people come the next election will really remember what happened during the pandemic? Not just Partygate, but then how, the incompetence, how many people died, the lack of PPE, the lack of preparedness. I mean, do you have any sense, Adam, of is this a big issue that
I
people...
think it is. We saw it coming up yesterday with Rishi Sunak, but
there you go.
It's something that that really... And if you look at where the big drops in Conservative Party support were, it's during Partygate and it's during Liz Truss's tenure. So those two big events. So it's the pandemic is a big part of it, 'cause it's just that basic breach of trust, because... Unlike other scandals, everyone lived through COVID. Everyone sacrificed something during COVID. So it's really personal.
So even though it's not mentioned a lot in the press or even in the context of this campaign, you think within people it is quite strong.
And on the doorstep, it's to people still bring it up, and that was the workers' question to the basic question was, how can we trust you? And
from that time when he was and just because we should wind up soon. That fascinating thing, the electorate actually have memories. The dancing baubles, the sort of whirly-gig of a campaign. Ed Davies falling off, skips, waterboarding. He's having a great campaign. I want to be a Lib Dem leader. Every water park is just having a great time. I wish we could do that, but actually, the public remember. And the one other thing I'm just wondering we should think about and just reflect on in terms of memory is Brexit. So. I think we have a better understanding now why Sunak called the election. Obviously it's much against the will of a lot of his party. And what I'm understanding, I think you suggested, Adam, he had to call it then because there could have been another leadership campaign. Yeah.
Well, I think it could have been a leadership campaign, or the Miranda policy could have fallen apart. I think is the big one, because the first flights would have taken off. The numbers of boats crossing would probably have gone up over the summer anyway.
Right.
There would then have been calls to leave the ECHR. That would have caused a massive split in the Conservative Party. Could have had resignations from the cabinet. It could have all gone even more wrong than it's gone.
But it's around these splits around international policy. Maybe next week we'll talk about Labour's policy, especially over Israel and Palestine. But on the sort of our foreign affairs, it is interesting, isn't it? If you think of the main architects of this huge event, which happened only in 2020, actually, finally. Brexit, only 4 years ago, but obviously the referendum was 8 years ago. Where are all the major architects of that?
Well, interestingly, one of the major architects of that, Michael Gove, one of the big moments of this campaign, saying he's standing down in this general election. And they do, all of the big figures have kind of gone. Even Lord Frost, I think, was being denied a candidacy in this election. Boris Johnson, of course, off the scene. He was meant to be hosting a show on GB News. No sign of that so far.
My goodness. What a shame.
I don't know what's happened. I'm not sure what's happened with that. But it does seem like everyone's left the field, with the exception, of course, of David Cameron, who has now returned.
But of the Leave campaigns, David Cameron, sort of like a rolling penny, whatever. And he obviously, for what I understand, is a very narrow circle of advisors advised him to go that way. And whatever that says about the Conservative Party is that the post-Brexit fictions within the Conservative hasn't unified them. But I'm fascinated. Basically, the three figures, to my mind, who led the official Vote Leave campaign, the unofficial Vote Leave EU campaign, they've all gone. What's Nigel Farage doing?
Well, Nigel Farage, that's an interesting point with the Reform Party. They just haven't been able to resurrect the success they had with UKIP and the Brexit Party at all. In the recent local elections, they won just 2 seats out of thousands of seats.
Council elections,
out of councillors out of thousands of seats that were up for contention. They're really struggling. As Zoe Gardner, immigration expert and campaigner, wrote for us today, it doesn't seem to have affected his coverage that he's getting. And he was on BBC Question Time last night.
He wants a debate.
He's all over the media.
He's calling for a debate.
Incredible. Yeah, he's not even standing.
Where's Richard Tice, the actual leader of the party?
Yeah.
But he's also said he's not standing.
But the voters aren't interested.
Yeah. And he's not standing. Where's he going to? He's going to support multiply convicted felon Donald Trump in America, isn't he?
And he's not talking about Brexit. He's not. Nobody wants to talk about it.
Even the Brexiteers.
But it's interesting. I think one of the most significant things about this campaign is his decision not to stand because he wants to campaign in the US. It does feel like right across the right, in the Conservative Party, in Reform, the focus is really shifting sort of across the Atlantic now to what's happening out there, and there's less and less of a focus from the right of British politics on what's actually happening in Britain anymore. And
we've had Labour not wanting to mention Brexit for 4 years. At least now the Brexiteers don't want to mention. We better wrap up on that, but I'm going to give you Josiah and Hardeep the last word. Hardeep, do you want to just any thoughts about this week and what you see future? And then, because you're the man with the diary, Josiah, hopefully we'll have some bloody manifestos launched soon so we'll actually see what these parties could. But Hardeep, do you want to sum up, and then Josiah maybe flag us up the week ahead?
Yeah, as I was saying, I think it's a flagging campaign from the beginning. There isn't the energy there. A lot of people think it's a foregone conclusion. What is likely to happen? I think Sunak is struggling, as Adam says. I think the Labour campaign has been dominated by the factionalism within the party, which I think is quite surprising that it's being done in such a public way. I know Labour won't talk about Brexit, but on this point about COVID, I am quite surprised that even on the pandemic, the Starmer and the leadership are not talking more about that. It impacted the entire country.
Or the corruption,
The corruption aspect and politically, but just the human aspect that people lost so many loved ones. And we've been through all of that since the last election. So I think it's interesting to see that the kind of news coverage has been towards Labour, and that's a sign of things to come. And I think the Tuesday evening is the first leadership debate in our very increasingly presidential style system between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. And maybe that will generate some more headlines. You know, when the election was announced, we all said this will be the dirtiest election campaign. We will see if that outwardly is the case. I think a lot of that, Josiah will come on to this, is happening below the surface.
Social media. Yeah.
Social media, all the electoral changes, that's all going on. So the dirty tricks are being played, but they're under the surface. But when are we going to see those moments outwardly of controversy and confrontation with these two particular leaders who are both sort of not seen as visionary for the country? I think the next week will tell us a bit more about that.
Josiah, any other thoughts for next week? What to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Hardeep touched on the TV debate on Tuesday. Tuesday is going to be quite a big day. The Labour National Executive Committee are basically signing off on every single Labour candidate, and because it's deemed a snap election, that means Labour's executive are basically taking full control over all of the candidates, essentially. So we could see some more of those spats over, whether any left wingers will be allowed to be Labour candidates this time. But also that day, I mean, we touched on the COVID inquiry. The post office inquiry is actually going on through this election campaign, and another major scandal, another sign for many that the British state just wasn't working as it should. British institutions were failing, and that happened under Labour, Lib Dems as a coalition, and the Conservatives. So I think they could all be slightly tarred by that if it gets any media attention next week. But I should just touch on Vote Watch, which is
I was going to say,
our
let's
campaign.
have a plug for that, please.
We have to give it a plug, of course. But it really a lot of our work on this stuff does rely on our readers and viewers and listeners. So we're relaunching Vote Watch, which is our campaign to monitor misinformation, dodgy campaigning. Where candidates and parties are falling short of what voters deserve this election, is just around the corner. And we really rely on people sending in what's going on the ground. So if you do spot something that doesn't look right, as the National Rail slogan goes, we'll pinch that. Do get in touch with the team. The email is votewatch24@bylinetimes.com. Of course, we're on all of the social media sites as well. So ping over your ideas.
And while that's a journalistic project, which I'm really proud that we've launched, because I think it's so important and already having an impact. We also hope that once the election is through, we hope to collate our findings into a report that we will hand to whoever is next in government, in the hope of laying bare all these problems that are happening on the ground that should be fixed. So I think if you do want to contribute in any way through funding or just giving us tips and stories, please do, because we hope that will be a more significant piece of work that might have some impact.
Yeah,
ultimately.
this is kind of crowd-funded and crowd-sourced. You can find out more at subscribe at bylinetimes.com, our crowdfunding page. I think we've already funded about 17,000. We went to get to 25. This is all to pay people. And this is where journalism can make a difference. We diagnose, we're not campaigners, we don't provide solutions, but we can provide a spectroscope, an X-ray of everything that's gone wrong with the voting. We're wrapping up for today, and maybe we should come back a bit earlier next week. Maybe, I don't know when the debates are, but maybe worth coming back on a Wednesday. We're free and flexible by popular demand. We're here at your service. And meanwhile, I should just say one thing. We've just been recording a great podcast series with Hardeep and Bonnie Greer, the American critic and playwright, which will be soon on Byline Audio. But already, if you want some light entertainment, when all these terrible things are happening to Jonathan Gullis and Ian Dale, and you find it sad, you can always head over and listen to Utter Bollocks, a great new podcast series mixed between general knowledge and a quiz show with our great writers for Byline Times, Otto English and John Mitchison. Have a laugh, get over it, and come back and join us next week. And thanks for listening and watching. Well, that's kind of, we got the good balance. I think we're slightly more energized with the cameras on. Do you know? We actually rattled through things.
Yeah.
I feel the opposite slightly, but
But no, I think we've got a good balance. I think we're a
I
bit
feel-
too energized at the top. We're being